A Podcask of Amontillado is a horror podcast, and so we may cover subjects that are not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to another episode of A Podcast of Amontillado, where we delve into the dark, dreadful, and terrifying parts of the world. Buckle up, because it'll be a terrifyingly good time.
And welcome back to the latest episode of A Podcast of Amontillado. As always, I am your co-host, Gary Mitchell. And joining us today is my lovely co-host,
Erin McGurn, and we are very excited to have
Michael G. Williams.
as our guest today.
So, Michael, who are you?
Mhm.
Oh, gosh. Let's see.
If you want, you can use the spiel that you use at the opening of every Arcane Carolinas.
There we go. So I am a multi-award winning novelist. I write horror, science fiction, and urban fantasy. And I've written vampire series that are like finished and everything. I've written time travel urban fantasy set in San Francisco, and I've written far future detective science fiction. And right now, my work in progress is an Appalachian set modern day ghost story.
Oh, that is a favorite genre of mine.
Excellent. Mine is all about like family trauma and messed up stuff.
Ooh, family trauma. That's so hot right now.
It is. It never gets old for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but between Encanto and Turning Red, but those are other podcast purviews. But I'm glad you mentioned the vampire series, because our topic today is vampires. And more specifically, the fact that vampires have, and correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, but vampires have always been a stand-in for lust and sex.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, at least in the modern Western take on vampires.
Oh, no, even well, if you want to say modern from Victorian era up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But even if you look back at the folklore of it, it was always a taboo.
Mm-hmm.
That the vampires represented some sort of taboo, whether that was greed or lust. Vampires have always been the dark desires.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And starting, and people will probably correct me if I'm wrong on this as well, but this is my the central thesis of our episode today is starting with a little book by a little known, hardly ever seen writer by the name of Anne Rice. Wrote a book about interviewing a vampire, and the LGBT community kind of like went, and it started becoming more of not just a sexual, but as Erin said, forbidden sexual. So my question to you, Michael, is vampires, how gay are they?
Extremely, like 100%. Vampires are 100% queer representation. And I don't care how straight the vampire story looks on the outside, because it is absolutely 100% essentially queer.
So there's a book or a novella that actually came out before Dracula by, I think, 26 years before Dracula was written, and it's called Carmela. And the main vampire in that is a lesbian. And that's one of the first published fictional vampiric stories, and your main character is gay.
Totally. And like in any iteration, in any generation's version of it, ultimately vampire stories are about characters who have a secret second life, and there are very few people who get to know the real them, for good or ill. And they have something that they want or need to do that the rest of society does not approve of, but the rest of the time they can just pass if they choose to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that's an inherently queer story, if you ask me. As a queer person, I think that that's an inherently queer story.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, though, that is a big part of it, that what you said, that identity and having to hide your identity is especially, because, to be honest, acceptance of the LGBT community, I'm not going to say it's great, but it's a little better than it was. And going back to even like the 90s and the 80s when vampire fiction, which vampire fiction tends to be like the undead. It rises, it comes back, it comes around for a while, then it kind of subdues again.
Waves.
With Anne Rice publishing in the 80s, that's when there was a very large push in LGBTQ rights was coming in, because there was the horrible, condemnable, irredeemable response of the Reagan government to the AIDS crisis. And there are a lot of people who like to equate vampirism with a disease. Do you think that tied into it as well? This whole having to identity, I am going to come out, I'm going to live as a vampire, whatever. That is a story, like you said, I think everybody in the community can relate to.
Well, I think if you look at when she wrote it, my very short answer is yes. My much longer answer, I have spent way too much time thinking about this answer, is if you look at when she wrote Interview in the early 70s, and it gets published in the mid 70s. And I think she wrote it consciously thinking this will be a metaphor for the queer experience, because she and her husband and they had lived in San Francisco. She had a lot of gay friends in San Francisco. She knew a lot about that experience of like having to go someplace and find the people who are like you so that you can learn about yourself and try to build a life. And then she goes and writes a novel about Louis, who, growing up, quote unquote, as a vampire in isolation, has no idea about his people or their traditions, and then he has to go someplace and find them. The fact that it doesn't go that great isn't, a statement of condemnation on her part or anything. It's just sort of acknowledging that sometimes there's drama. But then I think the reason why so many queer people were drawn to those books in the 80s is because, like you said, the rise of the HIV and AIDS epidemic and the utter disregard and, in fact, like active encouragement of it by the Reagan administration, and then the Bush, whatever number he was, administration. I think that there's this weird psychological draw for queer people to read those books at that time, because now not only is it a book about people with a forbidden identity and a forbidden life, it's also about blood. Like, it's really explicitly a book about blood and the way that blood is dangerous, and also the method by which it's obtained is appealing and like dangerously appealing. And I think that that is part of the psychology of what drew queer people to those books at that time. And then she goes and writes The Vampire Lestat in the late 80s, and it's a book about coming out. Like, it's a book about being like, hey, guess what? I don't care what anybody thinks. And so I think that she was very hooked into that. Her kid is the luckiest gay kid on the planet. That's all I have to say.
In 2012, she flat out came out and said that they were gay parents.
Totally.
And she has always been an advocate for LGBTQ rights.
Yeah.
And one of the funny articles I read was talking about her son when he came out, and said the only disappointment was that she then thought she wouldn't get grandkids. And other than that, she's like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
And how much of it is as a factor, do you think, of because of our culture? And like I said, it's a lot more accepting now, but I remember, and you remember, and everybody remembers, you get put in that outcast role, but inside it's like, this is just who I am. I'm not doing anything wrong, but everybody's condemning me for what I feel and for what I need and what I am. That correlates 1-to-1, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's perfect. There's no better metaphor out there, in my opinion.
Even go back so far as Dracula, that he wrote that in the time when Oscar Wilde, who was an incredibly close friend of his, was in prison for sodomy. So he writes this story that is about hiding who you are at that time period. And so many scholars nowadays believe that he was gay.
Really?
Yes. A lot of them believe Bram Stoker was gay. Who his closest associates were, were quite a large field of prominent gay authors. And there are inklings and hints here and there that his marriage was a sexless marriage. So I see a dog tail behind you and it makes me so
Yeah.
happy. Sorry. um, so there's a lot of scholars nowadays that believe he was closeted and he used Dracula as his expression of fear during that time period.
Sure.
Hmm. Yeah, because what happens when people find out someone's a vampire? They kill you. Growing up in the 80s, if someone found out you were gay, I mean,
Yeah. In 1993, when I was first handed a copy of Interview with the Vampire, I was a sophomore in college, and a woman that I knew from the computer labs on campus, because that was like my social scene, she handed me a copy of this book and said, "I think you would really enjoy this." And I read it and was like, "I do really enjoy this." Dracula was already my favorite novel of all time. I'd
mhm,
read Dracula in 6th grade from I read an abridged book fair, like a bookmobile copy, and was
mhm.
like, "I don't know if I totally get what this is about, but I'm pretty sure it's sex." And, and I loved that novel and still love that novel. I've probably read it 20 times at this point. And every time I read it, there's something new that I like have forgotten or I rediscover or I learn anew. Anyway, she handed me this book and I read it, and I mean like 10 pages in, I was like, "Oh, this is the gayest story I've ever read." And I have
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
and I'm on Usenet, you know. Uh and so that really hooked in for me. But at the same time, like literally the same year of college, I was the advertising manager for the queer newspaper on my campus, a campus so renowned for being to the left that Jesse Helms had made it his personal mission to attack the very existence of the university there. And at the same time, those of us who were on the staff of that newspaper were there was open debate within the staff as to whether we should run a staff photo in the
Mm.
publication, because there were people in that town, which at the time was easily the safest place for 400 miles in any direction to be a queer person. And there was open debate as to whether it was okay to run a staff photo. And in the end, out of the staff of like 15 of us who worked on it in some capacity, I think 5 of us stood together for a photo that we ran at the front. And everybody else was too scared because
Mhm.
it was really, really dangerous.
Yeah, I'm sad to say, while it is better, it's not as good as it should be.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, and we're in the seems like we're not to get political, but it seems like we're in a backlash swing right now, and hopefully we make it through that.
Yeah, the moralists, the
Mhm,
Puritans, have figured out that trans people are such a numerically small number of people
mhm,
compared to the larger queer population that they think that makes it easier for them to go after trans people, because
mhm,
the cis-hets just aren't going to care as much because they're going to frankly have lower odds of knowing a trans person, and in the end, that's what changes people's hearts and minds
Mhm.
is actually knowing someone.
yeah,
And I think that they've decided that that's the way to do it, that they can just like run the same playbook against trans people that they ran against gay people and against lesbians and against bisexual
mhm,
people in the 90s and all kinds of identities under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella,
mhm.
all the different ways there are of being queer. I think that they figured out that that's a group that they can go after and that they might be more vulnerable. And so they decided to just go guns a-blazing, often literally.
Mhm. Yes. I mean, all we have to do is look at the Florida, the
Yeah.
no, don't say gay bill, and
Although
the
that's
nightclub.
turning against them, thankfully.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank God.
thankfully. They tend to overreach, and it backlashes the backlash, thankfully,
Hmm.
but
'Cause
it's
there's
getting to
always
that point.
loopholes. Like,
Mhm,
they think they're so perfect in what they're doing that they don't realize that, like, how this law is written means
mhm.
moms and dads too.
Yeah.
That, like,
Yeah.
the teachers took the time and the effort to look through the law and pulled out, like, everybody is a they now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Hmm. I think that one of the dangers is to me, the most dangerous expression of it is the bills in various states targeting the existence of trans youth
Mhm.
and trying to say that trans youth have to be forcibly detransitioned, basically.
Yeah.
That's a real attempt at erasing a population. And they I think that it'll be easier for them to go after kids, which says a lot about where their priorities are.
Because it's all about them. That's
Yeah.
Oh,
all.
yeah. All right. And now that we've managed to piss off quite a few people who I don't mind pissing off,
Yeah.
You can turn
let's
us off right now and bye.
exactly. Yeah. Kiss my fang on the way out.
Yeah, right. I did once
getting
in a Vampire the Masquerade game play a vampire whose whole deal was that he was a serial killer of right-wing politicians.
Ooh, nice.
He was a Malkavian. That wasn't his madness. He just really enjoyed it.
Mhm.
It was just good. It was just a way to improve the world.
All right.
You know?
And that brings us to a lovely segue of a topic I wanted to bring up. I think another large influence is the Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game, because I remember when that came out and exploded onto the market because of the way it changed role-playing. It dragged it out of Dungeons and Dragons, made it more story-based as opposed to rolling the dice base, murder hobos, as we like to say today. And not only did it focus on story, focusing on that vampire story of living, do you become how far of a monster do you become to avoid becoming a complete monster? And because it was also so heavily based on Interview with a Vampire, it got really gay as a game.
Very, very, very. I have never played. Have I? I want to say that I have never played a game of Vampire where there was like meaningful heterosexuality.
No. I even played a version of it in a video game where like we built New Orleans, and I can think of like probably 3 straight characters out of 20 that we had playing the game. And it was an open world, so like anybody could come and put an application in to join the game. And so it wasn't like friends sitting around a table. And yeah, there were probably less than 5 straight people in this New Orleans setting. Because everybody got that, okay, you're a vampire. That means there's no like holding back. You can just be free, be whatever the fuck you want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in that game, there is this was always one of the fights that cropped up that amused me to no end, that kind of pointed out this kind of aspect of the subculture of the argument of whether or not vampires have sex. Per the rules, the game rules, the vampires do not have sex. The blood does not work that way. But I knew so many people was like, no, I'm a hot vampire and I am having some.
Yeah. Yes.
There's no way you can't tell me I'm immortal and this sexy and I don't get to excuse me?
Yeah. To the point that in at least some of the online games that I played, because I played on Muds and Muxes and Mushes and all that stuff in the 90s. And in at least some of those, and I want to say that it was lifted out of one of the source books that eventually acknowledged this. There was a stat called Masquerade, and basically the more dots in Masquerade you had, the better you were at seeming alive, up to and including, as Data says, fully functional. So that's a wild way to use blood, but hey, and there were people who were like, that was very important to their conception of playing a vampire.
It's like, don't you need to be able to like move around stealthily and change your gangrel form into a monster? No, it's much more important that my prick gets hard.
Yeah,
I'm putting my 5 dots in that.
Yeah.
And that's what, oh my gosh, I'm gonna drive myself nuts trying to think of this book series. But it was like an active part of the series that if the vampire had not fed enough, he could not get hard.
Sounds like what's her name?
Laurel K. Hamilton?
Laurel K. Hamilton. It sounds like something that she would do.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is part of the Anita Blake series.
Okay.
Which, don't get me started on that series. But
I've never read any of them, and I have nothing against them.
I read the first one or two. They were very good, but yeah, after send your hate mail to a podcast of Amontillado at gmail.com. But yeah, it turns, it starts out as horror vampire fiction with a little eroticism to here's some smut with some action every now and then we'll talk about. I mean, it kind
Yeah.
of to the
The
point where she
first
started
couple,
writing a distinct smut series, and even that wasn't
yeah.
enough to.
The first couple were amazing, great stories, great characters, and then it was just and, like, I'm a smut reader, and it just got to the point where I was like, "I need more than, like, 5 pages of story and 90 pages of smut."
Yeah.
But that is
And
an active part of hers, and the concept behind that, even the human physiology behind that, I love when things like that are included because logically that makes sense in vampire worlds, I guess.
yeah. Yeah, and if you love those books, please love your books, love what you love. But
Yes.
yeah, I had to tap out personally.
Yeah.
And I say that as Erin, as someone who actively enjoys reading some nice smutty
Mhm.
smut of smutning. Uh,
I'm an active part of smut talk, so
there
that
you
should
go.
say something. But I found a really interesting quote when I was looking into articles and things this week, getting back to our conversation. And it was, "There's a sexual attraction, but complete dread at the same time. An apt description of the feeling surrounding same-sex eroticism at this time." And it was geared towards the Victorian era when Dracula and Carmilla were written. But I think even that still applies to the 70s and 80s of Anne Rice and some of the
Hmm.
others who wrote during that period, that it translates so well because it's this driving force that you have for vampires. It's to get blood. Um, but it's this driving force that you have this feeling deep inside of you, and you're terrified of it because of how the world around you reacts to that. And I think that to me is like so profound that I hadn't thought of it in that way. That, yeah, how could it be anything else but a metaphor for queer? I
Yeah.
don't know how to say that.
Like, I've never thought of that either, and, like, yeah, like you said, that is deeply profound. That is
Mhm.
such an insight into it. It's
Hmm.
never occurred to me. Huh.
Yeah, because this culture even now is like you should is like it's but especially in the 80s, if you better not be gay, don't you be gay. And then when you start having that realization of I'm attracted to somebody I'm not supposed to be attracted to, and that struggle of fighting against it, struggling, doing everything you can not to give into that, to and accept that part of yourself, and then some people never make it over that hump, and I feel so that's so tragic. And the vampire, it's the same thing. Like I don't want to drink blood, but I have to, or I'll die.
And I think that coincides with, I always call them self-loathing vampires.
Mm.
Um, and you see that
You mean
dichotomy
like Louis?
in, yes, and that's exactly what I was gonna say. Louis is the epitome of a self-hating vampire, and Lestat is the exact opposite. He embraces it and experiences it and loves it. And I personally have always detested the self-hating vampire because I'm just like, suck it up and go do it.
Yeah,
Like
for real.
it is who you are. And I guess especially looking at this, it has me thinking of it in a different way because I've never had to hide that part of me. And so now I'm looking at it from that aspect and I'm kind of like, okay, maybe it's not as like his choice as I think it is. That the
Hmm.
self-loathing isn't something that he can just sit down and be like, "Okay, bye. Like I accept that I am a vampire and that the world
Hmm.
around me is going to accept that." It it brings a new light to that when you add in the aspect of someone who is hiding a piece of themselves, like their sexuality.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Oh no, I'm just like
Mm.
I'm processing all of this. This is really
Yeah.
good. New
Yeah.
stuff to
Well,
think
because
about.
I can tell you from my personal point of view of that awakening of my sexuality was broader than I thought. Thank God for the internet. That's how I found it. Just
Amen. Gosh.
and I think that also may be part of why it's getting more accepted. To get to
Mhm.
your point earlier from Michael is
Mhm.
if you know gay people, it's harder to hate them because you know them. It's not, the other. It's so easy to hate people you don't know and ascribe traits to them. And then when you go, oh no, yeah, that's just, Dave, and Dave's gay, but Dave's cool. I like Dave. Well, then maybe I'm wrong about gay people. Maybe they're more like Dave than the evil boogeymen that people are trying to make them out to be. But it took a lot of processing for me to go, okay, well, maybe I like that, but well, they just look very feminine. I can deal with that. It's they're triggering that part of my brain. And then it's like no, I'm doing some role playing in an online game, and okay, well, I'm gonna play a lesbian. I'm only with other lesbians, and then it just kind of snowballed and snowballed. Next thing I know, I'm like, oh my god, I'm not who I thought I was. And that again that's a jump a lot of people can handle, and it's a lot of people just can't.
In ironically, or not ironically, but coincidentally,
Mhm.
in my grad school program, I just finished writing a massive research paper and doing an original research project on the formation of queer community in Appalachia over time.
Mhm.
And the thing that struck me is that like every generation, basically since the 30s, has had to uh, recreate queer culture in Appalachia for themselves. And so, there's I read one research paper by somebody who actually is my fraternity brother because the world is tiny,
Mhm.
um, but who interviewed people who were describing like the queer cruising scene in this town in West Virginia in the 1930s, and then the lesbian sports car club that formed in that town in the 1950s,
Mm.
and then the bars that opened in that town in the 1970s, and the ways that like each generation had to go about finding each other
Mhm.
all over again. And the fact that
Mhm.
it's still happening, there's very contemporary research into this phenomenon. And in one of those contemporary sources, the introduction, the researcher said, and I just, again, this was something that, like, I guess I probably knew, but I've never sat down and thought about. But her point was every queer person is born into a culture that is not queer. Very few
Mm.
queer people are born into queer families. And so every queer person has to redo that dance of like A, discovering that they're not alone, B, finding other people who are like them, C, initiating communications with that culture. And it just, we always have to like rediscover the entire world for ourselves all over again. Everybody has to start back at square one. And that's just a really weird and interesting aspect of queer experience. And I think
Mhm.
that you're absolutely right. The internet has helped really shorten the map, really
Mhm.
like shorten the labyrinth from point A
Yeah.
to point B. Because I think before that, it was very difficult for us to find each other in safe ways. And that's why
Mhm.
so many people, that's why all of the gay ghettos in the major cities formed, just
Mhm.
because people, I mean, historically, because queer people came back from World War II and were like, well, I could go back to, my podunk
Sally.
town in the middle of a square state, or I could stay here in this coastal city where I just got discharged from the military, and I could stay with the people that I have found who were like me as I traveled the world in large numbers with people who were a lot like me.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's been a real historical phenomenon.
Yeah, if you want to know more about that, you especially want to look at the leather community and the motorcycle leather groups that formed after
Mhm.
World War II when they all came home. But that's a whole other panel.
Yes.
Yeah.
You just made me
Um,
think of something though with the rediscovering or not being born into gay families, so you have to figure it all out. It's the same thing as the stories where a vampire is created then abandoned.
Yes.
And even if they have their sire or whatever you want to call there, but even Anne Rice does it to Louis, to Lestat, that we so often see our main vampire characters are ones who did not get taught how to be vampires.
Yeah.
And so even that correlates with having to discover who you are on your own.
Yeah. There are almost no big vampire stories, and there's one glaring exception that I can immediately think of. There are almost no big vampire stories that are about the family of a
Oh,
vampire,
I think I know what
you
glaring
know? And
exception you're
yeah, I'm gonna skip talking about the
Yeah, no,
glaring
we
exception,
don't
but
need the sparkling.
yeah, but,
Yes.
that's like that is a glaring exception. Every other vampire story is about somebody who is essentially on their own, to the point that Lestat has been orphaned like 4
Multiple
different
times,
times in the
yeah.
books. I mean, he's like his mom has checked out on him, his maker checked out on him, his adopted family checked out on him. It's you just can't find really stories about queer. There are plenty of stories about vampires who sort of form a found
Mhm.
family. There are very few stories about vampires who come from a family.
Which is
Well, there's
what
your next book.
I've already written 5 of those. I
But
wrote a
that's
whole series about a vampire who like learns to have friends again.
exactly, and that's what and I think too of, like, the convention communities, and a lot of us refer to it as our tribe,
Yep.
and we find our people, and Gary and I and a mutual friend had the conversation the other day that, like, we're at the point where you get to choose who your family is, and you don't have to stick with the family that made you. And so that exactly fits into most of the vampiric literature that we have. That
Going
who
and
No, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah,
I have the
going
thought,
out
it's just not coming out.
going out, finding that community, finding out who's the drama queen, finding, who's who in it, making that into a family, and then it becomes all the interpersonal, which again is going to mirror a lot of what the LGBT community goes through. It's
Mhm.
like you go out, you find your people, you learn who you like, who you don't like, who's manipulating, driving. I mean, it is such a parallel that I can't believe there's anybody who fight against it. It's
Yeah.
like, no, vampires aren't gay at all. Like, are you kidding me?
Like even that is built into the game system of Vampire the Masquerade,
Mhm.
hmm
where you've got your coterie, who are your found family analog, you and your friends, and you're the
hmm
people who have decided that you can trust each other enough to go fight werewolves together, and there's
hmm
not really trusting each other more than that in Vampire the Masquerade. Like you're willing to sacrifice yourself and put yourself on the line for these people, and
Mhm.
you expect them
hmm
to do the same. But you're in this big bad world of the vampires, and in Vampire the Masquerade, that means that there are, I mean, depending on which faction you're playing, but maybe there are the harpies, who are essentially the mean queens who just hang out at
hmm
the bar all night and talk shit about everybody. And there's like the hot gays, and there's the insta gays, and then there's then you've got your
Your riot
gangrels and the
gays.
brujas at the
Mhm.
bear bar, and you've
hmm
got like the whole 9 yards. You've got the queer experience, and the way that even your own community can be intimidating,
hmm
like grafted into this, and how it's not always and uniformly a welcoming experience.
Mhm.
And so, like, you've got the drama sort of built into the system, but also that notion that there is this sort of enclave of safe people that you found.
hmm And oh, go ahead, Aaron.
It always coincides with me to this thought process of why women belittle each other.
Mm,
And it's very much the same thing with any LGBTQ community. It's like you all have been in that same position or a position that you can at least relate to. Like, why would you do that to each other?
hmm
And I don't know, talking about the vampiric families and how they bicker between each other all of the time is what makes me think of that. Is just like you're all there. You're like down to the core, you are the same. You have
hmm
had the same or similar life experiences. Why?
hmm Well, and just like in every community, it takes until bringing the werewolves back in. People are going to bicker amongst each other to figure out their position, because that's part of figuring out is who you are, is where you are in the social ladder,
Mhm.
and they're going to bicker each other to death, sometimes literally, until a big outside threat comes in, and then everybody's like, "Whoa, wait a minute." Oh, the
Yes.
werewolves are moving into town. Okay, now we're gonna. Oh, there's a mage. Let's go kill the mage before he does something like turn us all into soap bubbles. Uh,
Yeah, you can always spot the cis hets at the LARP because they're the
Mhm.
people playing werewolf.
yeah.
You
Well,
know,
that ties into this is a question that only occurred to me a few minutes ago, with vampires representing LGBTQ, and werewolves are almost always considered a metaphor for menstruation. Is that why they always put werewolves and vampires at loggerheads? It's an uncomfortable question.
I think for me, I think that in Vampire the Masquerade, it's because werewolves are so about biological reproduction.
hmm
Mhm.
Like everything about Werewolf the Apocalypse is about like getting the tribe together long enough to find some kinfolk and make some puppies. And then, hope that the world doesn't end or whatever.
hmm
And uh or whatever describes a lot of my opinions about werewolf. So but I think that in literature, most often it's because like werewolves are so biological, you know, like they're furry and they like walk around in the sunlight and they're big meaty monster mean things, and they don't in fiction always lack intellect or planning or
hmm
whatever. They don't. It's not that they don't have conscious motivation, but they're so much more like feral.
hmm
Whereas
They're the
vampires in fiction are
basic
almost always like
instincts.
the exquisite sort of peak of I am, I know what I'm doing. I'm totally in control. I am essentially a robot being driven around by my mind, and that's a very different, very cold, clinical sort of take on things.
I've always viewed werewolves as the primal instincts and vampires as the elegant.
mm
And the dislike between the two is the same thing that it's almost the exact same thing of fighting your primal instincts or your primal urges and what society is telling you those urges should be.
Because that is kind of the dichotomy of the vampire. They're that elegant, sophisticated, at least going back to Dracula, the elegant, the sophisticated, the count, very always, dressed to the nines in silvers, blacks, and reds, looking sharp. And then the whole, I gotta feed, and you get the blood all over the face and the mouth and the feral. And so it's like those two, again, two halves competing
Mhm.
against each other, which no LGBTQ person has ever had that struggle, right?
Never.
Yeah. Again, we're referencing this game a lot, but beast I am, lest the beast I become.
Mhm.
There's
Yeah.
a reason that was a tagline. So kind of stepping away from it, what are some other fictional examples? I mean, the first one that always comes to me for is, going back to predate, Interview with a Vampire, or around that same time, The Hunger.
Mhm.
Fantastic vampire movie, David Bowie, incredibly gay.
Very, very, very. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like probably the first big, I think, like big,
hmm
at least in my world, like bisexual, pansexual movie
hmm
that I can think of where there isn't like in that story, there aren't really straight people and queer
hmm
people. They're just people who are into each
Mhm.
other.
hmm Yeah, that's again part of the whole fascination of the vampires is like I don't care if you're male, I don't care if you're female, you've got blood. That means I'm into you. How about you, Erin? Are you
Oh
into blood?
gosh. That's an entirely different conversation which we're not gonna have here. um, so I read a lot, and a lot of what I read is supernatural fiction. Um, and one area that I'm gonna throw into this, and it may throw an entire curveball, is the Fae.
Mm,
That they are very much like the vampires in their morality almost, that they don't care what's between your legs. Like, if you can offer them something, they're interested. And so I can't, like, pinpoint one thing in particular that just, like I just keep going back to the first time I saw Interview with the Vampire. And thinking like, "Wow, Tom Cruise is super gay." Which I still don't think he wants to admit, but he entirely is.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Bye to the other half of the audience that was still here.
Due to the time of year that movie came out, I was in my hometown when I went to see it. And so there I am sitting in a theater, a packed theater, and in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And when they get to the scene in the Louvre, when when Louis and Armand are talking,
Mhm.
I hear someone behind me in the thick mountain drawl from which I sprang say aloud, just as loud as they possibly could, "If they kiss, I'm gonna leave." And and I just could not resist saying, "For the love of God, kiss each other." And and then I didn't have to hear that person anymore because they got the
Mhm.
point. But I was just like, "Oh my God, please, please, please kiss."
Well, and think about it too from a movie making aspect. You had Antonio Banderas. You
Mhm.
had Tom Cruise, Christian Slater, Brad Pitt, 4 of the hottest, most action-driven actors at that time period playing well, except for Christian Slater, playing flouncy vampires that
Mhm.
were dressed in frills and, like, things that no straight man and for anybody who's not a patron and isn't watching this video, I just did air quotations. Um, that is used to seeing these guys carrying around guns and blowing stuff up. That had to be a drastic shock to the viewers to see them
Mhm.
in such a different way. And I give the actors credit for taking on such a different role than what
Mhm.
most of the world knew them in.
Yeah, well, and especially Tom Cruise, because I remember before it came out, the second they announced him casting as Lestat, I remember an entire subculture going, "What?
Mhm.
Him?"
It's kind of the same thing when they cast him for The Mummy.
Right. But yeah, but in that case they were right. But getting back up,
But even
um,
Anne Rice said that
yeah,
it was a mistake to cast him and that she
Mhm.
didn't support the movie anymore. And then when
uh,
she saw rough cuts of the movie, she immediately came back out and said, "I was wrong."
yeah, she put out that full one-page ad, and I give him so much credit because he
Mhm.
threw himself into that part.
Yeah.
I mean,
At
he
least
was amazing in it.
I'm trying to think, did The Falls with Brad Pitt come out before?
Legends of the Fall, I think that
Yeah.
may have been after.
Oh, okay. Because I was thinking, like, at least when
Because
you compare tones and
mhm,
characters, like, there are a lot of similarities, but Brad Pitt can take on softer roles,
yeah,
and,
Yes.
like, at that time, we
and
knew that.
yeah, and he was still early in his career. He'd
Mhm.
done, like, Cool World and a few other things. He hadn't become Brad Pitt
Brad
yet,
Pitt.
but he was still like, "Oh, this Brad Pitt guy is someone to pay attention to."
Mhm.
And I've
I
said this
kinda
before
feel
and I'll
the
say it
same about
again.
Christian Slater.
Yeah. But Brad Pitt's a character actor that got stuck in a handsome boy body.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very much so.
If you look at the parts that he's really drawn to and some of the ones he's done, it's just like, oh man, if you were just like 30% less attractive, you'd be like the character actor,
Yeah.
the go-to character actor, and
Yeah.
you'd probably love it.
He'd be the
Well,
Ned Beatty of his day.
Exactly.
And everything Christian Slater had done up to that point, he was like the romantic interest.
Mhm.
And a lot of the time it was like a dark kind of twisted romantic interest or like an offbeat romantic interest. But even his character was
Well,
out of what people normally saw him in.
well, again, if we look at this, I don't want to turn this into an interview with the vampire, the podcast, but we can't help it. But it's like, you have Louis as the kind of self-hating. This is what I want to be. This is what I am, but I'm still struggling with my role and expectations from the straight world. And oh my God, oh, the angst, oh,
Right.
the horror, oh God, And then there's Lestat, who's the bitches. I'm out. Who wants to come be pretty? And then you have Christian Slater as that looks really cool. How do I get in on this?
Mhm.
He's the baby gay.
Yeah. And if you look at the eras that vampires have like resurfaced in pop culture, they are universally eras in which like the larger topic of human sexuality has come
Mhm.
more to the forefront of
Mhm.
culture in the West. And specifically when there has been sort of gay panic on a cultural level, you know. And so
Mhm.
if you look at like her writing these books in the 70s and the 80s, well, a lot of that I think has its origin in the 60s and in people becoming more aware in our society of
Mhm.
the existence of queer people and of queer people, not even just aware, but aware that queer people refused to participate in their own
Mhm.
erasure anymore.
Mhm.
And so I think that after you have things like Cooper's Donuts in the 50s or after the Compton's cafeteria riots and the Stonewall Inn riots in the 60s, then culture is sort of forced to confront that this exists in much the same way,
Mhm.
how have I of Oscar Wilde,
Yep.
and other scandals like that at that time, and the idea that, and in the 20s and 30s with the rise of the film adaptations,
Oh yeah.
you've got the appearance of gay bars in the West for the first time, and then
Mhm.
a ton of legal backlash against that in the Western powers in Europe and in North America in the late 20s and the early 30s, where that was sort of the rise of criminalization of sodomy laws and things like that.
Mhm.
So I think that when you see that, that is very much like society decides to make queerness into a monster, and vampires are a very convenient monster for it.
Mhm.
And instead of
They look
making it
just like us.
Yeah.
but and I think to a degree that almost backfires though,
Hmm.
because it isn't a monster that we fear. It's not the
Mhm.
creature from the Black Lagoon. It's not, and we'll use my my shirt as the example. It's not Frankenstein. It's not the Wolfman.
Yeah,
It's
unless you're
me.
one of the
Yeah.
unless you're one of the ones who looks like Max Shrek.
Mhm.
Right. I think that also there's a weird way in which all the stuff that happens after, I don't know, I guess I'll say after Stonewall, because that's when the other thing that I'm going to talk about also starts happening. But, prior to the 70s, let's say, the average action movie, quote unquote, male hero was like this sort of craggy
Mhm.
dude who wasn't like hot, quote
Mhm.
unquote. And then you start getting the Steve McQueens and you start getting on into like action movies of the 80s where it's just like shirtless ripped dudes, wall to wall shirtless ripped dudes, and they're marketing these movies to men as the thing to go
Mhm.
watch. And they know, I think, the people marketing these
Mhm.
films and the cultural forces like enabling all of that to happen, they know that they're saying to themselves, well, mostly people are going to go to this because they want to look like that.
Mhm.
But to some degree, they're going to go to these because they want to get on that. And like, I feel like there's a way there that our pop culture, especially in America, was like processing the rising awareness that queer people were not going away anytime soon. And a lot of queer people were out there living their best life. And there were a lot of non-queer people who I think were envious of that. And so you start getting these movies where it's being marketed as a guy movie, and it is just abs for days and glistening, covered in olive oil. And, that's just the movies that they were making for dudes who want to watch dudes be dudes with other dudes who just happen to look like this and touch each other a lot. And in a lot of ways, Interview with the Vampire is a perfect culmination of that. It's somebody putting it all out there and saying it openly for the first time instead of making it be, Rambo 14 or whatever.
Well, and
Maybe
I
we
think
should watch a Steve Reeves movie.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great way too for those in the film industry who couldn't be out. And they might have been out to the crews or the people of the studios. It was an open secret. Even back when the first Dracula was made. I can't remember his name and it's gonna drive me nuts, but the director was gay.
Mm.
And so, I mean, in Hollywood, it's always been an open secret that such a huge portion of your crews, your directors, your writers, your actors, your actresses were gay. And I think that that was also a way for Hollywood to let that show that it's like, yeah, I'm gay. I'm gonna make this movie where Patrick Swayze's not gonna have a shirt on for 90% of the movie. And I'm gonna go
Yeah.
let like my gay cohorts enjoy this too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the people listening at home, it's James Whale who directed Bride of Frankenstein. He was
Thank you.
yeah.
No?
Yeah. Todd Browning directed Dracula, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, it was Todd Browning, but it was also Carl Freund, and I think that's who I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Hold
But
on.
James Whale, I mean, they even made Gods and Monsters.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Ian McKellen.
Oh, so good.
Yeah,
So, like,
he pulls up with a lot of the stuff saying he was gay.
Todd Browning or the other guy?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, James Whale too then.
And I mean, again, open secret rumor mills of old Hollywood, who knows for sure.
Yeah.
Oh
But
yeah. All right,
it's the
so we'll
same
cut
thing that
back
we'll
in
never know
and
if Bram was.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of speculation that Todd Browning, who directed the original Dracula, was gay. And like we said before, it's open secret Hollywood, so it's a rumor mill. Like we're never gonna know for sure, and it's all speculation. But it does add kind of an interesting light to things.
Mm-hmm.
I've never thought about it this way before, but if you look at that original Dracula movie, I love that original adaptation. It's a phenomenally good adaptation. It is not in any I mean, there are ways in which it's true to the book. There are ways in which it's not. I don't think they matter. It's phenomenally good. And it's where the idea of like Dracula in the opera cape comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But even in that movie, him wearing that opera cape is a joke to the other characters. They think that it's hilarious that this guy has shown up dressed like a figure out of the 19th century. They cannot stop laughing over this guy in private. And in fact, the first time you see him in the opera cape, the next scene is Mina and Lucy like just yucking it up back at one of them's houses over this ridiculous figure. But so much of that movie is about here is this person who is clearly different, and whether the signs are subtle or otherwise, we can't talk about it openly. But as soon as the count is out of the room, we are going to laugh up our sleeves all night long.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's never occurred to me, but that is clearly an acknowledgement of sort of that queer experience of, especially at that time, of like the dandy in popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. And that is just a sad part of the culture for the longest time, the gay panic and just and queer coding, which we could go in for days on that. So in a way, I'm kind of glad that vampires, in their own way, are kind of dragging things out of the closet. It's like,
Mhm.
Hmm.
and it's a way to kind of safely explore that. Am I? Am I not? Who am I? Which everybody goes through. Even if you end up being, cis het, at the end of the day, you still thought about it.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's a way in which vampires introduce the idea of queerness, and I think in a way that a lot of people who are not themselves queer have to confront, and they find that uncomfortable, and that's a lot of what they find uncomfortable about vampires, period.
Mhm.
And
Hmm.
I love that for them. You know me, I love a queer coded villain because villains are powerful.
Mhm.
So I love it when the queer characters are the ones with all the power and none of the fucks left to give. And so I'm really into that. I think that's magnificent.
There's a part I'm remembering from Bram Stoker's Dracula the movie,
Hmm.
and I don't remember if it was in the book or not, and it's when, Dracula's wives go after Harker,
Hmm.
and he yells at them and says, "You can't touch him, he's mine."
Yes.
And
That is also in the novel.
okay, I couldn't remember if it was or it's been way too long since I've read that, I need to correct that.
Hmm.
Um, but there's the possessiveness in it that and you see it all through it that, like, even in the movie where he goes after Mina, Harker is always there, and there
Hmm.
is always these I'm picturing especially a scene where he is sitting at the desk in the Count's home,
Hmm.
going through paperwork, and the Count is just standing behind him with his hand on his shoulder, and there is something about that scene that is so sexually possessive that I'm like, "How do you see this and not think that Dracula could go that way?"
Yeah.
Hmm. Have either of you read? I've bought it and I haven't read it yet. But have either of you read the version that where it turned out it was a translation of Dracula? I think to somewhere in the Netherlands, where the guy basically was like, "Oh, this could be better," and basically rewrote the book, and no one figured this out for something like almost 80 years.
No.
Never
Yeah,
read it.
yeah. It's like literally this guy took it upon himself to rewrite Dracula and added more stuff into it in the translation. And
Hmm.
now I'm gonna have to research.
You brought up a point a little while ago about how vampire culture resurfaces when the outside world comes to a point. And I have a quote in here that actually corresponds with that that historically vampire stories have risen to meet the fears of the day. Vampires opposed whatever norm was dominant, and they represented the real people who went against the social grain.
Mm.
Yes.
And like that just fits what you were saying earlier perfectly that they are the outsiders that every outsider can relate to whether they have a thirst for blood or not.
Totally. You look at even Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where the vampires in that are so often aggressively anachronistic,
Mhm.
and their aggressive anachronism just makes them like more bleeding edge fashion wise.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, what is her name? Um, she was with Spike and Kind of Crazy. And
Drusilla.
thank you. I was like, her name started with the D. There are scenes with her that are so gay
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
that it's like, duh. And I think there was even alluded to at one point that like the four of them had a foursome.
Mhm.
And so
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like even for those who are so who they attempt to make so blatantly mainstream, there are still aspects to their behaviors. Even Spike, who is so almost offensively masculine
Spike had the hots for Angel Angelus
the
so
entire
bad.
time.
Yeah.
Not Angel, Angelus. He had the
Yeah.
hots for Angelus so
Yeah.
hard.
And
Um,
he has some traits still in that masculinity that are so effeminate and so attempted to be hidden. It
Mm-hmm.
it those ones interest me where it's like even as a vampire, they're still trying to stay with the social norms, even as they're out
Mm-hmm.
massacring villages. He reached this point where it was like, okay, this is the social norm not to like this sort of thing, so I'm gonna stick with it. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to even see that. And seeing that's the weaving of the studios, but
Oh yeah.
it's still interesting that they snuck that stuff in.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think that's another reason why they're so attractive to the LGBT community is because if you're seeing these people who are the outcasts, who are doing what's being told is you can't do that, that's forbidden, who are not only out there, they're doing it proudly, loudly, they're dominating everybody. Like there's this one scene from Angel where we do the flashback to them through history and the four of
Mhm.
them just walking through this town that they've raised. And it's just like it's like, yeah, that's a power fantasy, especially that's an outsider's power fantasy.
Mhm.
Yep.
And boy, howdy, did that speak to me on many levels.
I know I haven't watched that show in years, and I know like, I can picture what they're wearing in that
Hmm.
scene.
When Spike does that little hop over the cart,
Mhm.
I don't know why, but that's just like, ooh. But the book, I found it's Powers of Darkness, the lost version of Dracula. In 1900, Icelandic publisher and writer Vladimir Amundsen, and I butchered that, set out to translate Bram Stoker's Dracula, and he called it something in Norwegian, literally Powers of Darkness. And it has an original preface written by Stoker himself, published in Iceland in 1901, remained undiscovered outside the country until 1986, when a
Wow.
Dracula scholarship discovered Stoker's preface. And no one looked beyond the preface and deeper into the story until 2014, when literary researcher Hans de Roos dove into the full text, only to discover that Asmundsen hadn't merely translated Dracula, but penned an entirely new version of the story with all new characters and totally reworked the plot. The resulting narrative is one that is shorter, punchier, more erotic, and perhaps even more suspenseful than the original. It
Okay,
had
Dang.
never been published outside of Iceland until it was published in like 2016, it looks like.
you're gonna
I
have
need
to
to read
save
it.
that so we can have it in the show notes. Because yeah, I'm gonna have to add that
Yeah.
to my ever-growing to-read list.
Yeah. I've bought it like a few years ago and it's one, there's the link. It's in my Kindle waiting for me to get to it.
Mhm.
Is there any particular work, movie, novel, aside from your own, Michael, that you wanted to discuss that you thought people should know about that we haven't got to yet?
I feel like as soon as I say nah and we stop, then I'll have like 20 of them.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yes. Near Dark.
Ah, yes.
Okay.
Near Dark.
Very good movie.
A perfect study in how how the past is evil
Hmm.
and evil these characters in it, like they are evil vampires. They're not
Oh, yeah.
sexy. They're not like, oh, maybe
Mhm.
you want to get with us. They are just evil. And it is an incredibly compelling study of really terrible people. And it is not a story about queerness. It's a story about the toxicity of the nuclear family model.
Hmm.
And I love that movie.
I love when Twilight hit, they did a reissue of the movie on VHS, and they put a very Twilight picture of the lead actor guy. And
Yeah.
the blue is like, oh, there are going to be some people who pick up this movie, and they're going to be horribly, horribly horrified when it gets to. I hate it when they ain't been shaved.
Yeah. Oh, so good. Just like there's a scene of a shootout
Yes.
that's just so phenomenal. It's just so creative, so clever. Mm.
How about you, Aaron?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, and we mentioned Laurel K. Hamilton, and who was it who
Mhm.
wrote Sunglasses After Dark? Was that her, or was that someone else? Really?
Oh, actually, I just thought of one, but
Yes.
I'll answer this question first.
Well, while she sets that up, Michael, where can people find you?
You can find me in all kinds of places, but probably the easiest is michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. Or you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/Michael G. Williams author, in which M, G, W, and A are uppercase. And you can find me on Twitter as at McManlyPants.
And you have a lovely podcast called
Arcane Carolinas, where my co-host Charlie and I talk about weird stuff in the Carolinas, and occasionally we talk about Georgia too. And we talk about all kinds of stuff, you name it. We've done UFOs over Myrtle Beach. We've done the Brown Mountain Lights. We've done the Vampire Beast of Bladenboro. We've done hauntings in upstate South Carolina. We've done everything, you name it. And yet we have 3 years worth of episode ideas.
Yep, it's a lovely podcast. It's one of my favorites. And
Thank
myth,
you.
legends, and modern weird, I believe, is the way you put it.
Yes. The Carolinas myths, legends, and modern weird. I'm in the middle of editing an episode right now that we have found, like, there are so many different ways that the folkloric history of the Carolinas ties to itself, and people who have written about this stuff extensively, their work ends up touching all kinds of things, so that there's this particular folklorist named Charles Wedby, and we keep bumping into Wedby every time we explore something. And I'm in the middle of editing an episode where, like, Wedby pops up at the last minute to tie everything together, and I just was stunned when the very last thing I researched wound up touching his work.
Yep, and when we find a topic that fits, we will definitely have Charlie on here as well.
Excellent.
We do have an idea in the future that's horror and folklore, so.
Oh, good. I'll tell you now, his favorite franchise is Friday the 13th. So.
Yes.
Yeah, we may have to get him on for that then.
Yeah.
So, Michael, would you mind sitting in this chair in this alcove for just a moment?
I mean, sure, why not?
Wait. We didn't touch on my other one.
Oh, touch
We
on your other.
can't
Well,
do it yet.
settle down, Michael, and right here. And while Erin, you talk about what we're talking about.
Lost Boys.
Oh God, yes. How do we not talk about Lost Boys?
Yeah.
I
The
mean,
gang of maybe
very pretty
teenager,
gay
might
boys.
not be teenager, pretty boy vampires. Like, you talk about, and it goes back to what you were saying about that era of films where it was directed towards men. It was a lot of men touching each other and a lot of men without shirts. The not shirts didn't happen in this, but like there was a lot of male touching in that, and like behaviorisms that there's two in particular that I can picture. I can't think of the characters' names, but I'm like, they were totally boyfriends.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's a Joel Schumacher movie, so
Yep.
Yeah.
But yeah, especially it's the whole seduction part of it, the whole, that whole fear of, the gay people are going to come and find your teenage hot son and turn him. And then you have, their father figure vampire. One of my favorite lines in the whole movie is, "You invited me in. You have no power over me."
I especially the way that it's about, like, we're going to convince you that what we do is fun, and then we're going to get you to do it too. And then once you've done it with us, then there's no going back.
Yes. So good, so gay.
so
gay.
Oh man, that was a real moment of awakening when I was like 13.
Yeah, to the point that I have friends who will eventually be on this podcast. They went to Transylvania for, I believe it was their honeymoon, and they went to the real Dracula castle, and they did the tour and everything, and they go into the room which has got the crypt and the coffin, and they said hello kitty,
say hi.
Aw.
That'll be for the Patreons. They went in there and there was a poster, and it's not a poster of Bella. It's not a poster of Gary Oldman. It's a poster of Kiefer Sutherland as David on the wall.
Very believable.
Yeah.
Well, and it's the town is geared after Santa Cruz. And my mom grew up in Santa Cruz. and it's where it was filmed. And at that time period, it was the murder capital of the world, like it says on the sign.
Mm-hmm.
And she and I talked about it, and she's like, there was a very open gay community in Santa Cruz. And it's interesting to see. It was also during the time period where, yes, there was a very large open gay community. There was also a very large transient community that overlapped that, and a lot of them went missing,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody was paying attention to it. And so I think it's interesting that even Lost Boys touches on that, that like there's this fringe group here, and slowly but surely they're dwindling, and only the kids seem to be noticing. Like,
Hmm.
do you get where I'm going with that? Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
Yeah.
40% of runaway teens are queer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know,
Trying to get out of a horrible situation.
yeah.
Yep.
All right, so if you're listening to this and are interested in that side of the issues, please, it's the Trevor Project, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
The Matthew Shepard, is it Matthew Shepard? I mean, there's
Matthew Shepard's the group started by Matthew Shepard's parents is the Laramie Project.
Mhm.
Laramie Project. Thank you. Please donate, give what you can, and even if it's just, if you know some, people that need some help, you know, to kind of end on a serious note, which is unlike me.
I'm
But
just
there
double
are
checking to make
avenues
sure
if
I'm correct on that.
Yeah.
you need help, reach out, and you are not alone. Like, if you've
Yes.
made it through this entire episode, know that there are at least 3 other people
Mm-hmm.
that you have actively heard discuss this, that you are not alone.
And there's
Yes.
nothing wrong with you.
Mhm.
The Laramie Project is a play that
Oh,
was
okay.
written in cooperation with the Matthew Shepard Foundation.
There
So,
we go. All right. All right. So, Erin, you got the bricks?
Yep, right here.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Thank you for joining us, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us, and I look forward to you sticking around for a very, very long time here behind the wall.
oh, I would love to.
Thank you. And just putting in this last brick.
For the love of God, podcaster.
Yes, for the love of God. You have been listening to A Podcask of Amontillado, a production of Good to Be a Geek Media. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, then like, subscribe, and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. If you would like to support our efforts to explore all of the dark, dreadful, and terrifying parts of the world, please join our Patreon, where you can gain access to behind-the-scenes materials, backer-exclusive episodes, vote on upcoming topics, watch the video recordings of each episode, and other bonus content. Please visit our webpage, www.goodtobeageek.com/shows/APOA, where you can find show notes, host and guest bios, links, merch, and more. If you have any comments, questions, corrections, or suggestions for the host, please find and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, or send an email to apodcastofamontillado@gmail.com. We are also part of the Good to Be a Geek Discord. Feel free to descend into the catacombs for a visit anytime. Opening and closing music is Softly Shall You Sleep by Valentine Wolf. Please look them up on your music platform of choice or at www.valentinewolf.com. A Podcask of Amontillado is trademark and copyright Good to Be a Geek Media. Logo and show art is designed by Aaron McGorn. This episode was produced by Gary Mitchell. Avino Atrocitus. This broadcast is presented in partnership with Good to Be a Geek Media. Let your geek run wild. The opinions expressed in this broadcast do not necessarily reflect those of Good to Be a Geek. To learn more about this broadcast and other shows in the network, visit goodtobeageek.com or find Good to Be a Geek on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at goodtobeageek.